You're probably wondering why it looks like I'm talking, but there's no words coming out of my mouth. And the answer is simple. It's because I'm stupid. And when you're stupid, sometimes you start recording and you don't make sure that your camera's going to actually record any audio. Now, if I wasn't stupid, you might be hearing something along the lines of this. Do you want to see how I built this awesome floating shelf with just a few scraps of plywood from my basement? If so, stick around to the end of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel. Thanks, and I hope you enjoy watching. I started off with a few scraps of plywood. I used my track saw to rip a nice clean edge before I took them over to the table saw. Once I had the clean edge, I brought them to my table saw and I ripped them down to their final width. Next, I went over to the chop saw and just cut them down to length. Nothing fancy going on here. Once I had all my pieces cut, I just brought them over to the bench and mocked them up to make sure it was going to look exactly how I wanted it to. And yep, looks like a box. Perfect. Next, I sanded down the inside of everything before assembly because it's obviously very difficult to assemble a box and then sand the inside of it with all the corners. So I skipped the headache and did it before I put the box together. With everything assembled, I proceeded to run a hefty bead of glue where I'm going to join all of the pieces together. I then used my finger to spread the glue because I didn't know where my glue brush was. Then I frantically looked for a rag to wipe the glue off my finger and couldn't find one. After I found a rag, I did the same thing to the other side. Applied the glue, spread it with my finger, and wiped the glue off my finger. I then assembled everything, putting all the pieces together, making a basic box. I used these Bessie right angle clamps to clamp all the corners. That way everything's going to stay square. I only had 4 of these clamps, so I used some parallel clamps on the other side just to hold it while I screwed it in place with construction screws. And here I am just countersinking all the holes, drilling pilot holes, and then attaching everything with construction screws. I always make sure to use pilot holes when I'm drilling into the side of plywood, because you tend to split the panels easy if you don't. After everything was drilled and screwed together, I removed all the clamps, checked for a quick square, and then I proceeded to wipe the glue off the inside of the joints. Had a little bit of squeeze out, but not too bad. After everything was cleaned up, I grabbed some wood filler and filled all the holes, then sanded them down. Here I am using DAP plastic wood. It dries really fast. To hang this shelf, I'm going to use a French cleat. A French cleat is 2 strips of wood, one attached to the wall and one attached to the shelf, with a 45-degree angle cut in each one. The 2 angles interlock to form a tight connection. Here I am ripping the cleat pieces down to 4 inches wide. Then I adjust my blade to 45 degrees in order to make the angle for the cleat. Here I am checking it with a square and moving my fence over. I go ahead and rip off just the very end of the cleat piece to make a 45-degree angle and run both pieces through. Here you can see one piece will be attached to the wall and the other to the shelf, and they'll interlock just like that. With the angles cut in the cleat pieces, I went over the miter saw and just cut them to width so they would fit just inside of this shelf. As you can see, I got a nice snug fit, which is exactly what we want. To attach the cleat to the shelf, I decided to go with pocket screws. I could have drilled through the outside into the cleat, but then I would have more holes to patch. So I used the pocket hole jig from Craig and got everything in place and then just screwed it in. I figured the pocket hole screws would be strong enough to hold the weight of the shelf, and so far it hasn't fallen off the wall. Once the cleat was secured in place, I sanded everything down on the outside of the shelf. Sanding all the way to 220 because we're going to be painting this and we want a nice smooth underlayer. Once the shelf box was ready, I decided to add a face frame. Here I am ripping down some 3/4 inch poplar that I had laying around. I ripped it into 1.5 inch strips. Once all the strips were ripped down, I went over to my miter saw and cut them to fit the face of the shelf. When the 2 horizontal pieces were cut, I clamped them in place. Then I could get good measurements for the exact length of the vertical pieces. I then cut those and made sure they fit nice and snug. I then hooked the face frame together with glue and pocket screws. After the glue had dried, I gave it a quick test on the shelf. Everything looked good. So I went and got my glue bottle and glued it up. Put a bead of glue around the entire face frame, stuck it on there, and then tacked it in place using 18 gauge brad nails. I then filled all the nail holes, waited for the filler to dry, and sanded them smooth. Next, it's time to mask off the face frame to get ready to spray the cabinet. Here I am using blue painter's tape and sticking it to the inside of the face frame so the sticky part is facing out of the cabinet. Once I have a layer all the way around it, I'll use some red rosin paper. You can also use plastic, and just cut it to fit inside the face frame. As you can see, my piece of paper wasn't long enough here, so once I got it in place, I just filled the gap with more tape. It doesn't really matter what you use here, as long as no paint or primer is going to get to the inside of the shelf. This is the same for painting cabinets also. As you can see, nice seal. Alright, this thing's taped up and ready to paint. I got a rattle can of my favorite primer, the Bin shellac-based primer. I still have some in the gallon left from when I did the built-ins, but I don't feel like dirtying up the sprayer just for a small piece like this. And I think I'm going to get a better finish by spraying it with a rattle can versus brushing or rolling, although those work fine with this primer. And so I already shook this up for about a minute anyway. I'm going to give it another shake and then we'll start spraying. I just got a little bit of plastic down underneath. You're not going to get a lot of overspray with a rattle can, so you don't really have to worry about going crazy masking things off like when you're spraying with an actual paint sprayer. So I went at it, just spraying lightly, making sure I covered everything. There's not too much art really when you're using a spray can. Just make sure you don't get it on too thick because then you might have runs. And just make sure everything's covered. Once it was all sprayed, I let it dry for about 45 minutes. Then I sanded it down with a 220 sponge. Alright, we're back. This had about 45 minutes to dry. And we just went over everything with a 220 grit sanding sponge. Just lightly sanding the surface, getting all the little crumbs from the spray can and any debris that was in the air off the primer. And now we're ready to paint. First, we're going to just wipe it down with a rag or a tack cloth to get all the primer dust that we just sanded off of it. Now we're going to be rolling the paint on. If we were spraying, we'd leave the masking inside the face frame, but at this point we can take it off, so you get in there with a roller and a brush to touch it up. Also, you might not be able to see it, but there's a little edge in here on the inside of the face frame from where the paint met up with the masking and it left a lip. I'm going to hit that with the 220 real quick. I'm going to be painting this with Sherwin-Williams, the Emerald Urethane Trim and Cabinet Paint. It's an alkyd-based paint, which means it's water-based product, but it acts more like an oil, and it's going to give you a really hard, durable finish. This is one of the better things to paint cabinets with, other than going with like a 2K poly or something like that. So this is a quart. We had 3 quart samples that we're using for the kitchen cabinets to do test spots on them. So we bought three greenish paints, and actually wound up picking up a 4th and settling for that one. But this is just one of those leftover cans. It's good paint. I don't want it to go to waste. It's about half a quart, so it should be enough to coat this at least once. I don't think it'll really need 2. I'm just going to take a brush and touch up these inside corners of the face frame, and then this has to dry for at least 4 hours before you touch it. So we'll come back tomorrow and check it out. And here's the shelf the next day after the paint had a good chance to dry. If you want to see how this was installed, click the link and watch my basement makeover video.